Back in March, we talked to you a little bit about our strategy for the year, about how we were going to go about advocating for fair districts in Georgia. And we mentioned at that time a project we were working on with the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, and that has now reached a very important milestone that we're going to share with you tonight. In April, we held a town hall. We did kind of a redistricting 101, a little bit of background, a little bit of how redistricting works and what to expect this year. In your chat, you should be seeing links to the replays of these town halls. If you missed those town halls, please go back and take a look at them. We think they're pretty educational and helpful, and they help tell the story. That was April. And then in May, we did a special town hall focusing on minority representation and the Voting Rights Act. Very, very interesting program with some esteemed speakers, some of which are back with us tonight. So now here we are in June, and our purpose in this town hall really is to talk about the 20-year history of redistricting in Georgia. On the next slide, I want to talk just for a brief second about what we are asking to do differently this year. This is what we as fair districts are asking everybody to help us to change. We're asking the legislature to make 3 big changes this year. We call it listen, show your work, and check your work. Pretty basic ideas, but what does listening mean? And it means getting out and listening to the community and drawing maps based on community input. At the tail end of this meeting, we're going to talk about the hearings, which have now kicked off in the state, and we'll talk to you about how you can be involved in testifying and watching those hearings. So we'll save that for the end. The show your work part really is about, we want the legislature to be more public and transparent in the process. The hearing that occurred on June 15th, we heard all the right words from Senator Kennedy and Chairwoman Rich of the Senate and House committees about being public and transparent, but we think there's more work to be done, and we're going to talk a little bit in this session about what parts of the process need work and some of our advocacy around that. But really the bulk of this meeting, you're in for a treat about what we're talking about tonight, because it's to check your work. And this is about our advocacy around committing to in meeting independent, nonpartisan benchmarks for districts. We strongly believe that with the advanced technology that we are bringing to Georgia in partnership with the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, we now have the power as citizens to judge maps for fairness. We can look backwards and we can look forwards. So you're in for a treat tonight, because the first phase of our work with the Princeton Gerrymandering Project has now reached an important conclusion. And on the next slide, I'm going to introduce our 2 speakers for tonight. Hannah Whelan comes to us from the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. She is a senior data analyst. She's been a key member of the team at Princeton that has been doing tremendous work for us. And there's others from Princeton on the call, which I'll introduce a little bit later. But Hannah's been leading the effort to analyze the 20-year history of gerrymandering in Georgia. And then Sarah Hodges is with our Fair Districts Georgia team. Sarah is actually a cartographer, geographer, data scientist, and data visualization expert. So this is her cup of tea, so to speak, in terms of helping to make sense out of complicated data and geography and trying to tell a story about what does it tell us about our districts in Georgia. So with that, I'm going to turn the program over to Sarah first, who will kick off the presentation, and I'll be back at the end for some closing comments. Sarah and Hannah, thank you for joining us. Sarah, please take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Ken. I'm really happy to be here tonight. And I'm just going to jump right in and start walking you through the redistricting process in Georgia. So the General Assembly draws the map for all 3 chambers. The majority party controls that process almost entirely. They create the redistricting guidelines to govern the process, and they have public listening sessions, and then they work with outside consultants and the Legislative and Congressional Redistricting Office to draw the maps. This work is done almost entirely in private. It usually only involves the majority party leadership, really. The rank and file legislators are mostly excluded as much as private citizens are. So the Senate draws the Senate map, and the House draws the House map, and then they collaborate on the congressional map. Then the House and Senate have special session and floor votes, and there's a gentleman's agreement that they approve the map for the other chamber, and then it's sent to the governor's office. And if they sign it, those maps are now law. So on the surface, this looks fairly straightforward, but I'll walk you through some of the ways that the process is deeply flawed. First, much of the process is done in private or shared with the public in ways that discourage participation. Public meetings are often scheduled at the last minute, which makes it very difficult to know about or attend. District maps aren't released ahead of the meetings, Only the bill, which has census tracts or some other incomprehensible unit, are often shared, which makes it impossible for people to know what it means. This is the text of an actual redistricting bill to the right here, which I certainly cannot read. And legislator communications with the LCRO are legally privileged and confidential. So that's just like the attorney-client privilege. There's just then no way to know what criterion they're actually using to draw the maps. Finally, the General Assembly is not subject to Open Records or Open Meetings Act. So they don't have to release minutes or overviews of what they discuss, and it can just be very difficult to follow what's happening. So in general, public comment, public oversight, and public participation are discouraged at every stage of this process. There are also very few legally binding redistricting criteria. So there are the federal requirements that population must be approximately equal, and the maps must comply with the Voting Rights Act. But Georgia's only redistricting law is that the districts must be contiguous. There are several non-binding guidelines that they're required to consider. So these are the guidelines from the last time in 2011. And these include a lot of fair considerations like compactness, that they should avoid making elongated districts, communities of interest. So try not to split a group of people with a common set of concerns that may be affected by legislation. Existing political subdivisions. So avoid splitting existing boundaries. Avoid pairing incumbents. So don't draw the map so that two legislators will be in the same district. But these guidelines are created by the General Assembly themselves, and they aren't actually required to follow them. And they don't have to say what they considered when they drew the maps due to this final item that they may consider other factors. There's also a conflict of interest at every stage of the process. So legislators control the process, as I explained. So by letting politicians draw the boundaries, they're able to draw them to their advantage. Each chamber draws its own maps. So similarly, the fox is guarding the hen house. And the chambers have that gentleman's agreement I told you about to approve each other's maps. So there's just no oversight from the other chamber. Georgia's redistricting process allows politicians to pick their own constituents with little oversight and vague rules. This makes it very easy for politicians to manipulate the process. And finally, Georgia allows mid-decade redistricting. So far we've talked about the process of decennial redistricting, but Georgia actually allows legislators to redraw districts at every legislative session, not just after the census comes out, like many other states. Very few other states redraw districts mid-decade without a court order, in fact. And when they do, it is often a huge deal. In Georgia, on the other hand, since 2000, there have been 15 mid-decade redistricting bills brought to the floor, with 64 district boundaries changed. After the last successful mid-decade district map, the director of the LCRO actually said that the objective was to make the districts better for the incumbents to be reelected. Now, that's legal in Georgia, but it sure indicates that the priority of the people drawing the lines is reelection and not the people of Georgia. So it seems clear that the redistricting process in Georgia is flawed. And now for our analysis is designed to determine if our maps are flawed as well. So in the past, gerrymandered districts were obviously skewed, like this map drawn by Democrats in 2002. But computers have completely changed the way the maps are drawn and have increased the level of precision so that gerrymanders can be really hard to detect just by looking at a map. So to spot gerrymanders now, we have to use a more technical set of analysis tools. That's why Fair Districts Georgia and Princeton and the Princeton Gerrymandering Project have joined together to provide analysis to promote fair, unbiased redistricting this time around. So today we'll discuss the findings from phase 1 of our partnership, where we looked deeply at the last 2 redistricting cycles and the many mid-decade adjustments in between. So we've used phase 1 to first understand if, how, and where the district maps have been gerrymandered in the past, but also to define the processes to evaluate the next maps that they draw very quickly. So we're ready to start phase 2 as soon as the 2020 census data for redistricting is released. And then we'll create benchmarks and fairness tests with the same data that the General Assembly uses to draw their maps. And then we'll use all these methods to evaluate their proposed maps before they're passed and have a more informed discussion about the maps. The key questions we've been looking at in phase one are, how well does the legislature actually represent voters' preferences? And do the maps reflect voters' preferences? And do they reflect their communities? And would maps drawn without partisan influence do a better job? And then specifically, do the maps provide adequate minority representation? So first, we cataloged all of the redistricting events since 2000. That's shown here. So the three thick lines are the only three legally required redistricting events in that time period. So the first was the decennial redistricting drawn by the Democrats in 2001 after the 2000 census. That's that thick blue line. The House and Senate maps were actually found unconstitutional by the courts in Larios v. Cox, and the courts redrew the entire House and Senate map in 2004 with that dark gray line. And then the third was the decennial redistricting drawn by the GOP in 2011. That's that thick red line. But there have also been 15 other attempts to change the maps in this time period. So the 6 full-length thin lines indicate bills that were actually passed. So those are the 6 successful mid-decade adjustments that changed the 64 district boundaries in that time. The 8 shorter lines indicate the failed attempts. So these are just bills that didn't pass. So mid-decade adjustments in Georgia, sometimes they're needed for technical reasons or to correct errors, but they are generally unnecessary and not required by law or by court or by the census. And as we heard from the LCRO, they're sometimes used to make sure that incumbents will be reelected. Either way, they certainly impact what happens. So for the last 20 years, we compared every district map change from these redistricting bills and all the statewide election results under the simple principle that if a party's share of the vote increases, they should get more seats in the legislature. And conversely, if a party's share of the vote decreases, they should get fewer seats in the legislature. So to put it simply, we expect the General Assembly to change when voters' preferences change. So the lighter bar on the left shows the statewide percent of votes won by the GOP in statewide elections. We can't use the House elections themselves because there are so many uncontested elections that they're not an accurate representation of the statewide vote, unfortunately. The brighter bar on the right shows the percent of seats the GOP actually won that year. So we'll look at the elections here from the perspective of Republicans, but we could flip it and look from the perspective of the Democrats just as easily and show the exact same thing. So we'll start in 2000, just before the 2001 decennial redistricting, and look at the election results just after the Democrats redrew the entire House map. In the next election, in 2002, Republicans increased their statewide share of the vote to a majority, but didn't even win one more seat. The GOP's share of seats in the House actually stayed exactly the same. So this district map was just not responsive to voters. And in Larios v. Cox, the courts found that the district map was actually unconstitutional. And the courts redrew the state House maps in 2004. And sure enough, in the next election, with non-partisan maps drawn by the courts, the vote share and seat share both increased together. So the court-drawn maps were actually responsive to voters and restored that balance. The 2004 election was unique, unfortunately. It was the last election in Georgia that used a map that was not drawn by a politician with a stake in the outcome of that election. As soon as the GOP controlled the House, they passed a bill to change 8 House districts. And then in the next election in 2006, the GOP got the exact same share of votes as the previous election, but with the updated maps, they got 10 more seats. Then in 2011, when the GOP controlled the full redistricting process, they do the exact same thing the Democrats did in 2001. They drew the map so that even though the GOP's share of votes decreased, they increased the number of House seats, this time though to a supermajority. So the district map and the makeup of the state House of Representatives was just not responsive to voters' preferences. So here we can see that same 20-year time period all at once. And the vertical lines are redistricting events in the House that we've talked through. The thick lines are the completely new maps. The thin lines are the successful mid-decade adjustments in the House. And the red line going across shows the GOP's share of votes in each election. The black line shows the number of House seats. So this is just the same analysis we looked at with the bar charts. But when you look at the last 20 years all together, you can really see that both parties used redistricting to maintain partisan control. When the Democrats controlled redistricting, the time period with the blue background, the GOP vote share increased, but the number of GOP seats in the House did not respond to the preference of voters until the courts drew the lines, the time with the gray background starting in 2004. The court-drawn era is the only time in these 20 years that when the share of seats were responsive to voter preferences. And then when the GOP controlled decennial redistricting in 2011, the time periods with the red background, the GOP's share of votes decreased and resulted in the GOP increasing their seats in the House to that supermajority I talked about. So, and here you can see as of the most recent state House election in 2020, the GOP's share of the statewide vote slipped below 50%, but they still have 26 more seats than the Democrats, or a 13-seat majority. We also did a community level analysis of all the redistricting events since 2000 to look for clues into the priorities of the politicians drawing them. We looked at how the maps look now, how district lines have changed through the years and where they've changed. We discovered that in 2011, there was actually a 44% increase in small cities being split into more than one state House district. This map shows all of the small cities that are represented by multiple House districts now, and the purple cities are the ones that were cracked by the 2011 map. So these are cities with fewer than 54,000 people, so they could actually fit into one state House district in 2011, but were instead divided into multiple House districts. These are cities across the state, especially small cities surrounding Atlanta and in South Georgia. Many of these cities are more Democratic than their surrounding areas. So it's no surprise that when they split the GOP, when they were split, the GOP achieved a supermajority while their vote share decreased. So these are cities like Noonan that have one House district in 2010, and the 2011 map split them into three. Noonan's 33,000 residents in 2010 had the opportunity to elect a candidate to represent them in the state House. But split into three districts, there are a minority in each, and this community is just not well represented by the current House map. In cities like Lawrenceville, the then 28,000 people of Lawrenceville went from one district in 2010 to being cracked into 6 different districts in 2011. That's 6 districts. Residents of small cities around Georgia have distinct needs regarding housing and employment and transportation and land use. That's why the General Assembly has long considered existing political subdivisions and communities of interest when they draw the district lines. But that all changed in the 2011 map. And it appears that they now systemically break apart small cities across the state, reducing their representation in the General Assembly. Now, if you're familiar with Lawrenceville, I won't be surprised if this House map doesn't look familiar to you, because the district lines have actually changed twice since then. They changed in 2012 and 2015 in the mid-decade redistricting, and then the House brought up a bill to change them again in 2019 that failed. We can't say why they keep changing the lines in Lawrenceville, since the map drawing is done in secret, but we do know that splitting a city into several districts can have major repercussions on their ability to have a voice in the legislature that advocates for their needs. So looking at the 20-year history of the Senate, like we did with the House, you can see the exact same story. So I won't go into nearly as much detail as I did in the House, but similarly, you can see that the party that controls drawing the districts has a huge advantage in the elections afterwards. And when in 2004, the courts drew the lines for the Senate also, voter preferences and seat share were more aligned. It's clear that the way the maps are being drawn in both the House and the Senate are to the advantage of the party in power rather than to reflect the preferences of voters. So these are the precinct level election results from the 2020 presidential election. Now, there is no doubt that Georgia is politically polarized, but is Georgia so polarized that it's not possible to draw maps that are responsive to voters' preferences? We really don't think so. But to answer that question, we use a statistical simulation. And with that, I will hand it over to Hannah from the Princeton Gerrymandering Project to talk through the Senate fairness benchmarks.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. All right, so yeah, let's dive into the simulation that Sarah just talked about. So exactly, to think about this question about how much of these effects we're seeing were caused by the polarization, or what we call the political geography of the state. My team at Princeton, we decided to use a computer to draw hundreds of thousands of maps that comply with the redistricting laws of Georgia, so that we could take a look at what that would produce. So this computer used a simulation that followed traditional redistricting criteria. So each one of these many maps, it behaved like you'd expect it to. They couldn't split county boundaries any more than existing maps. And they had to have just as many Voting Rights Act compliant districts, which we'll talk about later. They couldn't really have those long, snaky districts. We wouldn't include those because we really wanted these maps to follow the redistricting norms of the state so that we could build a baseline to compare things to. So this resulted in 500,000 state Senate maps, each one meeting the redistricting laws and guidelines of the state. And anything that we could calculate about the current Senate map, we could also calculate about any of those 500,000 maps. And we could actually calculate it for all of them in aggregate. So let's dive in a little bit there. So let's go to the next slide, where we talk about how one of the many things that we can calculate about each district in each map is the Black population of the district. So after doing this for all the districts, we're able to create benchmarks around the racial balance of the model. So we're going to look specifically at the state Senate a little bit. And for each map in the simulation, like I said, we calculated the percent Black voting age population, or BVAP. If you see BVAP, that's what it stands for. We're using 2010 census data because that's the population data that the General Assembly had access to and had to use when they were creating those maps. We get a value for each district in each map, and you can see the map in the middle here, colored purple, by the density of Black voting age population. So the darker ones have a higher percentage. We can also display that on a plot. That's what you see next to it, where each dot is one district, and we rank them from least to greatest Black voting age population. And we do this so we can visually see the range of BVAP population for Senate districts, and we can get a good feel for the behavior and the intent of the map. And then we can actually layer these charts for each one of the 500,000 maps in the model. And you can see the expected BVAP range of the typical unbiased Senate map. So the first thing I want to point out about this figure here is that we have two shaded zones, one that we call the Black majority districts and the opportunity zone. So the Black majority districts, we've oversimplified the Voting Rights Act and Voting Rights Act compliant districts to those above 50% Black voting age population, which becomes a majority minority district. The Voting Rights Act says that you have to draw as many of these as is really feasible, and that you can't really go back You can't retrogress and have a map that's worse than in the past. So all of our maps had to have at least 15, like the current Senate map. The zone right below it is called the opportunity zone. We'll talk about that more later. Just know the districts in this range, they're called opportunity districts, and they're key for increasing minority representation on top of what's required for the Voting Rights Act. So now in this figure, we're looking at the range of values in our 500,000 simulated maps. And we're looking at what we should expect to see in Georgia, given the redistricting norms and the distribution of people in the state. So we're going to focus on this yellow ribbon-like shape running through the middle, which is our range. And you can see a sharp point in the middle. That's there because we required every map to have at least 15 of those majority-minority districts. So if you look closely, especially over on the right, you can see a dark tan band in the center of this ribbon. And that represents the most common values that we saw in our many, many maps. The lighter region on either side of that represents where almost all the values we saw were. And anything outside of that ribbon would be deemed unusual given these methods. Let's see. So the purple dots in the middle of this ribbon, those are the median dots, and those represent districts with the percent BVAP that you'd expect in the average unbiased map. And overall, the yellow ribbon is just the range of things you'd expect to see. But if you go to the next slide, you can see the actual values, and you can see it doesn't actually look like the yellow band at all. You can see quite a few outside of the expected range. And the first thing that stands out to me is this large dramatic gap right around that opportunity zone. So we actually have 0 districts representing a range that falls in that 35 to 50% BVAP range. And this, I said, was the opportunity zone. It's called that because districts with 37 to 50% Black voting age population have the opportunity to elect the candidate of choice for the Black community through coalitions with other groups of voters. And studies have shown that in Georgia, districts with at least 37% BVAP, they can and they do elect the Black community's candidate. So here we see that the current map, it complies with the Voting Rights Act by drawing 15 districts above the 50% line, but in a way that creates fewer Black opportunity districts than you would expect. And in particular, you could see that a lot of the districts above the 50% range have a higher percent Black voting age population than any of the 500,000 maps we compared them to. And similarly, the districts right below the opportunity zone, they have a lower BVAP percentage than we observed. So these are the districts that have extreme behavior we'd never expect. And looking specifically at just those, there's actually 13 specific extreme districts. And their location is actually really, really telling. So you can see here, there's 8 above that 50% line, and there's 5 right below the 37% line. So you see that trend, it's pretty stark. And it shows just how that opportunity zone could have been avoided. It's starting to look like those districts above the opportunity zone were sort of overpacked with Black voters, and the districts right below maybe were slightly cracked to avoid any extra minority representation in what was legally required. Going to the next slide, we can look at that a little bit differently. To put it differently, we can say that 98% of the 500,000 simulated Senate maps that we drew both complied with the Voting Rights Act in the same way and had more Black opportunity districts. And most of the maps, so if you look at this figure on the right, you can see we added up how many times we saw different values, different numbers of districts in that opportunity zone. And the current map is right there with where the Black line is with 0. So 0 districts in the opportunity zone here. And you can see the most common value was actually 2. A decent amount had 1, and just about as many had 3, and just a few had 4. And let's see, is there problem with the audio? Let me know if I should change anything. But yeah, here you can see 98% of these maps actually had more. So this is telling us that the lack of opportunity districts, it seems to be based on considerations other than the geography of the state, because clearly with a computer, we were able to get districts that did it a little bit better. But we're going to zoom into some of those districts on the ground to see if that's really the case. So here we're going to look specifically at 3 of our outliers. We have districts 22, 23, and 26, where district 22 includes the city of Augusta. We saw some folks from there in the chat. 22 and 26 here are above our opportunity zone, with 55 and 57% Black voting age population. And district 23 is right underneath the opportunity zone at 34%. So combined, we see there are 2 VRA compliant districts and 1 just out of the opportunity zone. So if you look though at the distribution of Black population in this area, you see, it's not really split into 3 obvious areas where 2 of them would have a BVAP majority and 1 wouldn't. In fact, the Black voting age population in these 3 districts combined is 49%, and it's pretty evenly distributed throughout this whole area. So while it was really impossible to draw 3 majority BVAP districts in this area, there's no reason for 23 to be there right below the opportunity zone. It is possible to draw 22 and 26 so that Black voters were not overpacked and could give Black voters in District 23 the opportunity to elect their candidate of choice with coalitions of other voters in the district. So the Senate map, it seems like it could actually comply with the Voting Rights Act and amplify the voice of Black voters, but maybe politics is getting in the way, which is sort of what Sarah was describing to us earlier. And I'm actually going to throw it back to Sarah now so she can go into some of the partisan effects that we started to see in the Senate map and some of the other maps. But yeah, this was how we did the math.
Great, thank you so much, Hannah. Yeah, as Hannah said, I will now go through the fairness benchmarks for partisan representation in the Senate as well. So for each one of those simulation maps that Hannah was describing, we can calculate how recent statewide elections would have turned out under that map. So the map on the left here is an example of one of those 500,000 simulated maps for the Senate. The second map shows the estimated results of the 2016 presidential race for each Senate district in that simulated map. And then the chart on the right shows those results too. So each dot is a Senate district sorted from the least Democratic on the left to the most Democratic on the right. And we show it this way just so we can visually see the partisan range across our simulated Senate districts for the 2016 election. And we did the same for the governor's race for 2018 and the presidential race from 2020. And then we average the 3 statewide elections to get the partisan lean of recent elections. So this just gives us a sense of the partisan nature of each district in this time period without the effects of a particular candidate. So in the 20-year history, we presented the charts from the GOP perspective. So now for this analysis, we're looking at it from the Democratic perspective. We could really look at it either way, but we're equal opportunity critics here. So we want to switch the perspective of our analysis to ensure that we're looking critically at both parties. So we create this partisan lean and this chart so we can visually see the flow for each of the 500,000 unbiased simulations in our model. And then we stack all 500 of those charts on top of each other, just like Hannah explained for the Black voting age population. And we get this chart that illustrates the range of the values we saw in all of the simulated maps combined. So another way to say that is it's the range you would expect an unbiased Senate map to look like. So similarly, the tan center part is the area around the median, and as you get farther away from the center, the fewer times it occurred in the maps in the simulation. So from this, we can see that we would expect the district with the fewest votes for Democrats to be between 15 and 17%. That's on the lower left. And the most Democratic votes to be between 91 and 94%. That's on the upper right. And you would expect all the districts in between to fall within this ribbon. So next, we'll compare the current Senate map to see if there are indications of political influence in the map. So this is what the actual Senate district map looks like. So the tan ribbon is still the range of percent Democrat that you would expect the map to fall within. But now we've overlaid the partisan lean of every district in the actual Senate map. And the results are pretty remarkable. There are clear indications of gerrymandering, especially in these Democratic districts in the top. So first, you can notice the gentle S shape of the curve. That is just often an indication of gerrymandering. But highlighting these extreme outlier districts is helpful to see what's actually going on. So 18 of the 56 Senate districts are extreme outliers. That means that none of the 500,000 simulations behaved that way. They show evidence of political influence or gerrymandering. There are 10 extreme districts with more Democratic voters than expected, and 8 districts with more Republican voters than expected. But all of the extreme districts with higher than expected share of the Democratic votes are in Democratic districts, so as you can see in the upper right of this chart. And the extreme districts with higher than expected share of Republican votes are all in the competitive zone or strongly Republican districts. So this could indicate packing and cracking of Democratic voters for partisan advantage. So that's when many voters of one type are put in the same district. So that's called packing, which can result in nearby districts with fewer voters of that type than you would expect. So that's called cracking. Packing and cracking is a term commonly used to describe this method of gerrymandering, which in this case could result in fewer Democratic seats in the Senate. The bottom line is our current enacted state Senate map is drawn so that the districts are actually more polarized than you would expect. So yes, Georgia may be politically polarized, but not as much as the map indicates. So the way the state Senate map is drawn increases the polarization rather than trying to create a Senate that accurately represents Georgia. And this isn't good for Georgians of any political party. This competitive zone that I speak of, this is the range where politicians would have to compete for their job. So that's between 45 and 55% of either party. Where the district may vote for the Democratic candidate in one election and the Republican candidate in another. If you pack districts so that they're more polarized, like in this Senate map, then there are likely to be fewer competitive elections. And candidates can then get elected even if they don't actually represent their constituents very well. So these two charts compare the results in the current Senate map with the estimated results of the 500,000 maps in Princeton simulation. So on the left, the purple bars show that we should expect between 21 and 29 Democratic districts in the Senate over this time period. The current Senate map elected 22 Democrats on average. Within the expected range, yes, but 98% of the simulated maps would elect 1 to 6 more Democratic seats in the Senate. The most likely is 2 to 3 more Democratic seats. And the chart on the right compares the number of competitive races in the Senate. So how many senators actually have to work to win their district? In the current map, that's only 4 districts. So there are only 4 Senate districts in all of Georgia where the partisan lean is close enough that it's truly a contest of who is the better candidate. The simulation shows that we should expect much more. 91% of the maps in the simulation produced 1 to 9 more competitive elections in the Senate than we actually see. This should be shocking, but it just follows the trend of politicians of both parties using redistricting for partisan advantage and not to reflect the people of Georgia. It verifies the imbalance between share of votes and share of seats we saw in the state Senate for the last 20 years, and indicates that the imbalances are not from polarization, but because of partisan gerrymandering. Now, there's nothing illegal here. In 2019, the Supreme Court ruled that partisan gerrymandering is legal, or really that it's a political question that the courts can't speak to. But that doesn't mean it's fair. What it certainly shows is that the lines are being drawn to favor the politicians and not the people of Georgia. But there are many impacts of uncompetitive elections. Opposition candidates don't run. Elections are decided in the primary, which leads to more extreme candidates. People don't turn out to vote. They hear loud and clear that their vote doesn't matter. And then there's the worst case scenario, uncontested elections, where there's only one candidate from the major parties running for the seat. So there's actually no choice at all. This is unfortunately extremely common in Georgia. In 2020, 50% of the state Senate elections were uncontested, and 52% of the state House elections were uncontested. The national average isn't great at 35%, but Georgia has a particularly bad problem. And it has repercussions beyond just the uncontested elections. Our election analysis shows that the voter turnout for president in 2020 was 7.4 percentage points lower in state House districts with only one candidate. So if all the districts had the same voter turnout as districts with contested districts, there would have been 295,000 more votes cast for president, we estimate. And that's an election that was decided by 12,000 votes. So uncontested elections both tell voters they have no choice and their votes don't matter, and they can be truly decisive. So this was a deep dive into some of the results of our 20-year history. These are the sort of analyses that are usually shown in court cases after the fact. But FDGA and PGP have come together so that we can provide this analysis both to understand the past, but also in phase 2 to use as a tool to determine whether the next maps are fair before they actually become law. So let me just briefly walk you through the results for all 3 chambers for all of these analyses we've completed. So for the state Senate, as we discussed, there is evidence of partisan gerrymandering. There are 1 to 6 fewer Democratic districts than expected, and 1 to 9 fewer competitive districts. The Senate map does comply with the Voting Rights Act, but the map could have the same number of Black majority districts and have 1 to 3 more Black opportunity districts. Our observations show that there was decennial gerrymandering by the Democrats in 2001 and the Republicans in 2011. There was extensive mid-decade redistricting, and there's evidence of Black voter packing and cracking, which eliminates those opportunity districts. In the state House, there's evidence of partisan gerrymandering as well. There's 1 to 7 fewer Democratic districts than expected, but that doesn't seem to reduce the number of competitive districts. There are actually more competitive districts in the House than current House map than in 80% of the simulated maps. And there are 47 majority Black districts, as we expect, and actually more Black opportunity districts than 98% of the maps. So our observations say, yes, there's decennial gerrymandering by both the Democrats and the Republicans. There was extensive mid-decade redistricting, and 2/3 of the small cities are split. And there is evidence of Black voter packing and cracking, but it actually does not seem to be negatively impacting minority representation in the state. And finally, Congress. Congress doesn't show evidence of partisan gerrymandering according to the Democratic seats or the number of competitive districts. There are 4 Black majority districts according to the 2010 census, as expected. It is possible to create 1 Black opportunity district, but it wasn't that common in our simulation. So our observations show there was mid-decade redistricting in the previous map, but the current map hasn't changed since 2011. So 10 years after it was drawn, and with huge demographic shifts in Georgia, they have actually increased the competitiveness of the congressional map, and there is not a whole lot of evidence of partisan gerrymandering left in those maps. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to Ken to talk about what's next.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Hannah. I want to just comment as we move to the next slide there. Thank you that the teams at Fair Districts Georgia and Princeton are doing a phenomenal job here. I just want to highlight Hannah and 2 other folks who are on the call tonight, Ari Goldblum-Helsner and Amanda Kometz from Princeton, who have been doing phenomenal work over the last 6 months with us. And then on the Fair Districts Georgia side, it's Karen McCown, who's answering some of your questions in the chat, and Raynell Solar and Sarah, who are part of our mapping and analysis team. So this is great work, but you have your work cut out for you, because guess what happens next? All that work that you just saw that took about 6 months to do to look at these benchmarks, we now want to do that again when we get the census data. And the idea here is that imagine all those fairness tests and benchmarks can be had before the maps are drawn by the legislature. That is our goal. That is the whole game plan around advocating for fair maps with this data. Again, the census data will come out in mid-August. That release is probably going to be enough. There may be some additional data in September, but as soon as we can, after we get those benchmarks, that data, we are going to then create these benchmarks. So what the benchmarks will look like is, across State House, Senate, and Congress, how many what's the range of Republican districts you might expect? What's the range of Democratic districts? What's the range of competitive districts? What does the majority representation look like in terms of, VRA compliant districts and opportunity districts? So we will be creating these benchmarks in advance of the maps being drawn, and we're going to offer these benchmarks to the legislature, and we are going to publish them. So basically, we are calling out what looks like fair to us in advance. Then when the maps are actually produced by the legislature, we will rapidly evaluate those maps against the benchmarks, and we'll be able to give them the check mark and say, this map is fair or this map is not in these different dimensions. So we think this is a game changer. This kind of analysis that you've seen tonight has never been done in Georgia before. In fact, some of these techniques did not exist in 2011. So we are really, really pleased to have this partnership with Princeton to help bring this to Georgia for the first time. Skip to the next slide then. So why do these benchmarks? Like, how can we convince the legislature it's a good idea? Well, first of all, we're arguing for transparency. And when you have checks going on by independent experts, that helps to inject transparency into the process. We have now, the people of Georgia are now armed through us with the kind of data and the kind of tools that can be used, right? We have to basically democratize the process of redistricting through the work that we're doing here, right? Our legislature is fond of talking about public trust and confidence in the process. This is what will do it for people on redistricting. One of the things that will do it, right, is to look at how independent checks look at these maps. Demonstrating compliance with the Voting Rights Act, that's really is going to be required by the legislature anyway. In fact, it may help the legislature avoid litigation if the maps are actually drawn to these benchmarks. And ultimately, it's fairer districts, right? If you are following the goings on in Washington, I just want to make one interesting comment that Joe Manchin, who's the senator, who's at the center of this whole debate over HR 1, S1, one of the things he said in his proposed compromise around voting rights, which is going to be debated this week in the Senate, was stop partisan gerrymandering and use computers. Hey, Joe, guess what? We're doing it right here. So we're all in favor of that idea, and we're actually demonstrating that it can be done. Let me just switch to the next slide here. Look, the next thing is it's your turn to speak, folks. This is your chance to stand up and be heard. The public hearings are now underway. The first one was on June 15th. There's a replay of that on the General Assembly's website. I think there's a link going in your chat to listen to that replay. There are hearings going on throughout the state. You can see the schedule. The next one is in Atlanta at the state capitol, then Cumming, then Dalton. They're doing like 9 different locations around the state. There's one more virtual session in July, which I assume would be hosted at the Capitol, but typically is going to be a virtual session. So testifying at these hearings is actually pretty simple. I did it, so I can tell you my experience. You get 2 minutes to tell what you want to tell. Literally, you get 2 minutes. No one's going to challenge you with any questions you can't answer. This is your chance to talk about what you want out of redistricting. Now, how do you know how to do that? Well, we have a testimony toolkit that's available. There's a link going in your chat. There is a training tomorrow. The card on the right-hand side talks about a training event that occurs tomorrow from 5 to 7 p.m. We, along with Fair Count and the Georgia Redistricting Alliance and several organizations are sponsoring this. There's some training on how to get yourself ready to talk. But all you have to do is talk for 2 minutes. Now, you could talk about the idea of benchmarks or global things, but I think it's very powerful to talk about your location. Tell the representatives what you want for Athens and Augusta and Brunswick and the areas that are surrounding them. Unfortunately, not every city is covered. So find the closest one. Go to the state legislature's website. The locations on the ones for July 6th and later, the actual physical location hasn't been published yet, but it will be. But this is your chance to speak and say, here's what I think I want in terms of fairness. Here is how I would like to, I'd like to be represented. This is really your chance to do it. It's painless. It's quite simple. Spend some time with the toolkit. Get your 2-minute story ready. They will time you. I will tell you that. They will time you at 2 minutes, but you can stand up and talk and be heard in this process. The last comment I'll make on this slide is our next town hall will be Monday, the July 26th at 7 p.m. Topic to be determined, but we'll be again in the thick of these hearings, and we'll probably have something to say about how the hearings are going. We're going to open it up for questions and answers now, I think. Please put your questions in the chat. I think people have been doing that already. I neglected to mention that at the beginning, but we are going to open it up for questions and answers now. And I'm going to ask Karen McCowan. I think we can stop sharing the screen now so we can see folks. And I'm going to ask Karen McCowan to, some of the questions have been answered, but many have not. And so Karen McCowan, if you would now just tee up some of the questions that you think we should answer here. Oh, let me just make one other comment.
Go ahead. Sorry.
So one other comment. We'd like you to fill out a survey about this program. A link is going in the chat if it hasn't already about the survey for this program. We'll put it in now. We really would like your evaluation of this program. Tell us what you thought of it. And by the way, tell us what you'd like to see in future town halls. We're trying to keep everybody informed, keep everybody involved in the process, and give you them as much information as we can. So please go ahead and click that link now or in the next couple of days and give us your evaluation of the program. Karen, go ahead with the questions.
Sure. There was a question about how closely we think, or how we can tell how closely seat share and vote share should track, and whether they should be exactly the same or how much variation might be allowed. And I don't know who wants to answer that question. Hannah or Sarah, do you have something you could say about it?
I mean, one thing that I would say is it's true that the exact proportions are never going to be exactly the same, because these are districts that are representing the state. So we don't expect them to be exactly the same. But what we do really expect is when the voters' preferences change dramatically, that the representation in the legislature should also change dramatically. So I can't say a specific number of how close they should actually be, but they should be tracking with each other. And then I think Hannah's research is really where it takes off from there.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Ken.
Well, there's a couple factors that affect the difference in those numbers. One is the political geography, but that's what the Princeton research reveals is what's the right balance. The other thing is that, not all seats are contested. Obviously, we'd love to have all the seats contested, but if some seats aren't contested, it could mean that there was an opportunity to contest a seat and someone didn't do it, and therefore the number would be off. But the best benchmark will be the political geography analysis that Princeton does to help us understand how the map should look.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add to that, those were perfect answers, is just that it's a very state-specific thing, and that it's really hard to have one answer that makes sense in Georgia versus Massachusetts versus Indiana. So that's why we do this research, and we make 500,000 maps just of the state Senate, so we can really see what does carving the state of Georgia up into that many specific pieces do, and use that as our benchmark.
Great, excellent answers. Another question was, how did Republicans prove an unfair map in 2002? And can we use that again in 2021? And maybe Hannah, you'd like to take the first crack at that.
Sure. I think the way that Larios v. Cox was able to be successful was because it violated the one person, one vote rule. So there was the judges saw that districts out in the rural areas had been sort of overpacked, just how we saw some BVAP districts overpacked. This was total population. So some districts had more population than you'd expect, and some districts had fewer population than you'd expect. And there was a meaning to those. The ones with fewer population were in you know, around Atlanta and ended up benefiting Democrats. And that was a story that the judges could clearly see. So it's about telling that story about having terrible, ugly districts that are clearly gerrymanders. And computers have sort of allowed politicians to be able to do that now without it being such an easy thing for a judge to be able to tell. And I don't know if Ken or Sarah, you have anything to add there.
Yeah, I would say the other thing about Lawrence v. Cox is that you know, that was a partisan gerrymandering case, and those are not going to be allowed anymore. However, I would say that there was a very strong correlation in Georgia between minority voting and Democrats, and so if you see gerrymandering on the from a if we see gerrymandering from a minority representation point of view, you know, that is also going to help level. If we can combat that, it should help level the playing field somewhat on the partisan gerrymandering. But you know, they're somewhat independent, but they're also related.
Okay, Sarah, I think I'd like to direct this next question to you. What were the events or factors that caused the courts to determine that redistricting was necessary in the past?
Wait, can you say that again?
Well, I think the idea is that what triggers redistricting, and there is the decennial redistricting that is required, you know, by the Constitution. But what about all the mid-cycle redistricting? Do other states do that?
So there are the other states do that sometimes. And one of my sort of favorite examples of this is from Texas in, I think it was 2002. Some of you might remember when the part of the legislature left the state of Texas to go to New Mexico in protest and completely stopped legislation. There's something similar happening now. But back in 2002, this was in response to mid-decade redistricting at the congressional level. That was Tom DeLay was in charge of this, and it was just complete political pandemonium, and the entire state was shut down. In Georgia, this has happened 15 times in the past 20 years, and it you know, it just seems like business as usual.
Absolutely. There are, you know, I think more states don't allow mid-decade redistricting than do. Some states, and there were questions about when can redistricting be legally challenged? Some of that it depends on state law. Some states have laws that are in their state constitutions that allow legal challenges that unfortunately Georgia does not. So we really have to rely on public pressure here. About the only real hard-coded law in our state constitution is that districts be contiguous. That is, they can't be, you know, geographically divided. But the other guidelines you saw at the beginning of the presentation about drawing districts are just that. They are guidelines that can be adopted or can be discarded.
I just want to make a comment that we are at the end of the hour. However, our speakers are able to stay on. So if there are further questions, we are happy to stay over until people's questions are pretty much exhausted. We can stay over a few minutes. If you just are not able to stay for the full time, we want to thank you again for joining. We encourage you to get out and testify, or at least watch the hearings. They'll all be live streamed. This is your time to get involved. At the point where we publish these benchmarks in the fall, there will be another round of advocacy, or a lot of advocacy, because that'll be a crunch time when the maps are coming out. And we want everybody to stand up and say, here's what's fair, right? So these hearings, I think, are good opportunities, and really don't be scared of them. It's easy to do. 2 minutes, you talk, that's your chance to be heard. So thank you again for coming, and we'll stay on and handle further questions for a bit here.
Okay, well, Ken, this question is really right down your alley. Is there any reasonable justification for keeping the map drawing secret, or is it just a matter of political expediency? Is there any point in trying to get the legislature to open the process to public scrutiny?
Look, Georgians have a right to know. I mean, we're going to live with these maps for the next 10 years. So I personally can see no reason why this is secret. A law was passed in 2012, I think it was, that made it secret, that made it even more secret. I I get very angry at this stuff because Georgians have a right to know how the maps were being drawn, what were the criteria, what were all the factors that were considered. The guidelines that were used in 2011 were, I'll call them loosey-goosey at best. That's probably a kind term. Some people would critique them more harshly. But I can't see any reason why this process should be secret. And what we heard from, Senator Kennedy and Representative Rich, who are the chairs of the Senate House Committee, at the June 15th public hearing, they said we want to be public, we want to be transparent. Well, great, let's hold them to that, right? This is a big point of our advocacy this year. We wrote them a letter on April 19th, making 15 specific suggestions on how to make the process more transparent. We have heard nothing. So we are angry and we are not happy. And so we are taking matters into our hands as much as we can by providing benchmarks to show what's fair.
Okay, great. Question for you, Hannah, because this is about the majority minority districts. Does the presence of extreme districts that are outside what we would expect to see always indicate the opportunity for additional minority majority districts, i.e., the situation that you saw or that you pointed out or explained about how District 22, 23, and 26, I think, were adjacent. Is that always the case?
Yeah, so first of all, I want to point out that our ensemble never saw a plan for any of these that had more majority minority opportunity districts. I think for Congress there is the potential for maybe one more, but in terms of districts that are 50% or above BVAP, it seemed like all of these maps had exactly what we would expect. We did see in that one example a case where a slight unpacking of some of those opportunity districts could allow something to become an opportunity, or of the majority minority districts could allow a district to become an opportunity district. But just because you see a range that has a yellow band that has some in that opportunity zone doesn't necessarily mean that it's possible. You really have to be able to go and look at the districts and see, would you be moving around, would these numbers be moving in ways that meaningfully changed a district into that opportunity zone. So that's why we showed you those histograms. Those are the plots with the bars. That's another way to look at it and to see how many of the maps that we pulled out actually had different behavior. But the maps that we're generating, they're really not maps that you would ever want to use as an actual map for Georgia. It just tells us what's possible and gives us an idea of what we could try for if we were going to fire up Dave's redistricting app and try to draw a map.
Anna, I know you've done some experimenting with trying to draw those districts, and do you have anything to add to that? My understanding is, that's not always the case. Just because it looks like you can draw, those districts have to be geographically contiguous. They have to have the population that can actually be drawn into another district without, in fact, doing a reverse gerrymander.
Yeah, and there are a lot of other, things that we are trying to achieve with the districting plans and maps. So we're trying to represent all communities appropriately. So there's just a lot of things that go into it. So you really do, as Hannah was saying, have to go in and actually try drawing these maps. I will say that everything we've been talking about has been using the 2010 census data, and everything will be entirely different when the new 2020 census data comes out, and we'll be redrawing entirely different maps.
I think that's most of the questions that I have seen.
Looking on one, someone, there was a question just very tail end about the, let me just cover this one if I can.
Sure.
Questions about lawsuits. Are there particular points which need to be made during the hearings?
Oh, thank you.
Grounds for lawsuits, right? And I would say that the biggest thing we can do in the hearings is to help define our communities of interest. We can say, we are defining a community. Maybe it's centered around a church, maybe it's centered around a business interest, maybe it's a civic community. Like, how about the citizens of Lawrenceville define their community in that hearing and say, we want to be represented cohesively, so that when the map comes out and it's not represented cohesively, that's a basis for challenging it. Again, that's challenging on a community basis. That's probably the best we can do. The most profitable angle, or the most, I shouldn't say profitable, the most likely angle for legal challenges is going to be around the Voting Rights Act and minority representation. Pure partisan is going to be very difficult to do in the courts. So I think that, plus all the benchmarking work, we can get the legislature to commit to following benchmarks, and then they don't. I think that's a basis for an argument. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't tell you how great a court case that is, but it seems to me that the more facts we put in front of the legislature and the more community input that we get in front of them, when they're not following it, I think, at least in the court of public opinion, it becomes harder to defend the maps.
Okay. I see in the chat, I'm glad, yeah, Hannah and Amy Kamitz from PGP are answering a question from someone about the using the data that we did using the 2011 maps, the 2010 census, and the recent elections. And again, Hannah, maybe you could expand upon that just a bit.
Yeah, I guess just one clarification to make. You know, we look at the 2010 population data because for the entire decade, that's the data that really matters for redistricting. But we have this whole decade, an entire decade of election data really to use to analyze how these plans, what they did in terms of political parties. So we did look at these maps with the data set that we were able to get together. And that tells us, what do these maps do to people in Georgia the way they voted in 2016 and 18 and 20. It turns out for the congressional map, it doesn't look terrible based on the way people voted in those elections, but we also saw some seats flip in those elections. So we have a hunch that if we use election data that looks more like the way voters voted in 2008, which was the election data that the General Assembly probably had access to when they were drawing those old maps, you know, that might actually be able to show, to tell us the intent behind those lines themselves. So we're really excited to look into that 2012 data set that FDGA put together, and I think it's going to tell us some really important stuff. But that also shows how important it is for us to have more recent elections like 2020 data when we're going to be analyzing the new maps that come out this summer, later this summer. So
the other thing too I'd like to add about the maps that I think is really interesting is, even though the decennial redistricting redrew the maps comprehensively in 2011, in that they redrew, well, actually the ones, they redo more than the ones we were studying, which are Congress, State House, and State Senate. They redraw, you know, other electoral maps as well. But those maps have been altered since then. Although the congressional map is still the one that was drawn in 2011, so it actually dates from 2011. The Senate map was actually altered with a bill that was passed in 2012 but didn't take effect until 2014. So in fact, the state Senate map, the the current map really dates from 2014. The state house map dates from 2015 because they had 2 rounds of mid-cycle redistricting. Didn't change all the districts, but as I believe Hannah pointed out, I think there were what, 40 did we decide that were changed since 2011? I think it was something like
64, yeah.
64 have been changed in the last 20 years, but I think you know, they between the state house and the state senate, something like 40 to 50 were changed. So you know, you're kind of getting not a snapshot of a single year, but a view of the trend over the decade.
I'd like to highlight a question that's being asked. I think Packy McKibben has asked this question. It's a very, very interesting question. Are Georgia citizens going to be able to give input on the maps the legislature proposes? You know, is there anything about any input after the 10 town halls that we've already listed or done? The legislature has been asked to provide hearings and to provide some public comment sessions after the maps are done. That question was asked directly of Representative Rich at the June 15th hearing. And I will tell you that the answer was sort of a disappointing statement. It was sort of a nothing burger, not a good answer. It depends on the data, blah, blah, blah. I think this is really important. I think that there should be, in fact, we've asked in our April letter, and many of the organizations, we have 20 organizations signed that letter in April saying, one of the things you got to have is the ability to comment on the maps themselves, and especially after the census data are released, right? So it's nice that you're listening now, but what about when the maps are out? How do we get input on that, right? I imagine that we know there will be some hearings at the Capitol during the special session to review the maps. That might be just one per committee, and then it's a vote. I mean, I don't know how much time they're going to spend doing that, but we are advocating for, and I think one of the things, if you go to the hearings, one of the things you should ask for at these hearings is to say, we'd like a chance to comment on the maps when they're done. We want that opportunity. Just stand up and make that your 2-minute speech. The more they hear that, the more chance we have of getting something like that done. Really and truly, that's part of the input that we can ask them for. So, Packy, at the moment, I'm not encouraged by what I've heard, but I think that's something we absolutely can advocate for. If they want to be transparent, let's make that one of the transparency requirements.
I also see a question from Mary Lou Etzel about, besides testifying at the legislators' meetings and educating our community, what else can we do? Do the postcard campaigns really matter? We think public pressure in general matters. And people have been, some of our folks have been posting links in the chat about volunteering to get involved. We have an active legislative advocacy group. We have a very active letters to the editor initiative that has gotten letters to the editor posted all across the state. And that is something, again, if you're ready to take a step beyond postcards and do something a little more involved, you know, sign up for that. So there, and in addition, of course, testifying at the hearings. Our legislators need to hear from us. They need, one of the reasons that gerrymandering and that the mid-cycle redistricting has worked in the past is because they were able to kind of do it under the table. You know, no one really understood what it was, or not many people did. Not many people paid attention to it. You know, that when it was happening, they were able to bring up proposed maps in a committee hearing, vote on it right away, bring it to the floor like in the next couple of days, and pass it without anyone really knowing. And what we found out in the last 5 years or so is when people started to pay attention, they were just flabbergasted that anyone was doing anything about this. And unfortunately, with the state constitution in Georgia, we simply have to keep the pressure on. Let's see, list of representatives and senators on the reapportionment committee. I believe that's posted on our website, is it not, Ken?
It should be. Maybe if Barbara Leach can fish that off the website. I think it's on the website. I don't remember the exact page, but we can get you a link to that on the website. Absolutely.
I think there is a link on the website. So
anything else? Comment about we need a team of lawyers to make this process public and fair. Well, that's one of the ideas. I mean, I will say that we are one organization in the state. Another key one is the ACLU of Georgia. They do have a team of lawyers looking at this process. There are other organizations that are probably will take the lead on litigation more than we would. We actually have a very experienced lawyer working in our volunteer team, who I saw earlier on the program. I don't know if he is still with us, but we actually do have folks who have legal experience in this space, helping to strategize with us about how to approach all this. At this point, this is a giant public pressure campaign. I think a really, really key aspect of it is to get the media involved. We need the media to be telling the story. The media has been picking up on the story now that the hearings have started. But I'll be frank with you and say they have not yet picked up the story about the secrecy that much, right? We wrote this letter in April. They have not ever called and said, hey, what's the problem with the secrecy? Well, we can tell you what the problem with secrecy is. We want the media to be calling the legislature and say, what about that letter? Why is the process secret? Can you agree to some of these changes? Here's one of the simple things we're asking for. We want a 2-week period from when a map is released to the public to when you're going to hold a hearing and vote on it. In the past, that's been like an over the weekend type of thing. We're simply asking for 2 weeks to review a map that is going to govern our elections for a decade. That's certainly reasonable. I would like the media to be helping to ask that question. If you know people in the media, your local newspaper, your local, radio outlet, whomever you know, we got to get the media to help advocate for this story, because at the end of the day, this is just it's going to require a team effort across all of Georgia to try to get these changes made. Is there anything else we should cover?
Well, maybe just one more. Shall we say this is the last question? I know. Maybe Hannah could speak to this about the census delay and when we think that we will have data that we can work with, and maybe address the idea of the August interim census release versus the September 30th release.
Yeah, so we are definitely far delayed. We would have normally already had a lot more census data and be a lot further along in the process. The census has said it's going to come out with its data by September 30th in the formal capacity that includes CDs of the data being sent to states and an easy website interface that allows people like us to download data. But they have, in response to some lawsuits about how long that delay is by state legislatures who know they're going to have to do this really quick, they've said that they're going to come out with what's called legacy data by August 16th at the latest. And it turns out that data is really easy for someone like you or like me and Sarah to use. You just need to know a little bit of code and you can download everything and use it just the same. So I know we're planning on getting access to that data and using it early. All of the major redistricting tools like Dave's redistricting app, they're all going to have that in pretty quickly after August 15th. And I think that means that state legislatures probably will also start thinking about their maps. So I think the end of August is when we're going to start seeing legislatures hop into action. There's redistricting commissions across the country that are already starting to draw draft maps, given some estimates. So I don't think it will take too long after that for us to start seeing maps. But it's also about the time that you all should be hopping into those map drawing tools and drawing what you think an ideal map is as well. Because our team, we're going to want to score the legislature's proposals, and we're also going to want to score the maps that you guys think are good, so we can compare these scores and really show, that we know that's not the only way you can redistrict Georgia. So late August and all of September is going to be full of tons of maps. maybe we can draw 500,000 just with all of us.
Great, excellent. I think maybe, and with that, Ken, I don't know.
Thank you again, everybody, for joining. This has been a wonderful conversation. We would love to hear from you. If you have other ideas on what we can be doing, info@fairdistrictsga.org is our email address. We're looking for ways to make this all work. So again, we'll be back with you in late July with our next town hall, but stay tuned. We send out a newsletter every week. Stay tuned, and thank you for joining the fight. Bye-bye now. Have a good evening.
Thank you.